Perfecto. So thank you so much for those of you that have logged in on a Friday afternoon. It's so interesting that right now at this very unique time in our country's history, this work is still taking place, but there's just absolutely so much work to be done. And so I'm grateful that you all made the time to come and learn from our two guests. We're going to be focusing obviously on the work of anti-bias and anti-racism in schools. I have to tell you, Maisha and Mayra, that as a former principal, I've served in both dual language and monolingual settings. And I just am so missing the principalship because it is the best job in the world. It allows you an opportunity to really collaboratively guide all of this work in an educational community. So thank you for being with us. For the participants, just as an FYI, we will be chatting for about 45 minutes, and then we will leave about 15 minutes at the end in case you have any questions. If you'll do the favor of posing the questions at that point so that they don't get lost in the chat box, but we will try to answer some of your questions as well and share resources and all of those things so that you can have that readily available. Just some norms: stay engaged, experience discomfort. I know that all of us have positive intent, expect and accept non-closure, and again, write those questions in the chat box. Prior to the one that I facilitated last Friday, I was meeting with a person from Zoom, and they said, are you sure that you want to have everything open for participants because they can just unmute themselves and speak? And I said, the world of education is very civil, and so we are going to manage this really, really well, even if we have a large group, which we do. So thank you for that. Okay, Mayra and Maisha, so we're gonna get started. And just as an FYI, for those of you that are joining us, I sent a couple of questions to Maisha and Mayra just to frame our conversation, but the truth is that we're gonna take it wherever it feels like the conversation needs to go. So Maisha and Mayra, would you tell us a little bit about yourselves and the communities that you serve? And actually, I should start by asking, how are you both doing, because you all are doing the difficult work in school communities? And whoever would like to start, if you would unmute yourself. There you go.
Thanks, I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. Ira, how are you doing? So I'll go ahead and start. Just to introduce myself. I think I might be having some tech difficulties. I'm doing well, really excited to be with everyone today, specifically on this day, Juneteenth, which is a really special day just to me personally, in my personal celebration. Just to give everybody a little bit of background, I'm Maisha Riddlesberger, principal at Ketchum Elementary School, which is a school here in Washington, D.C. I serve at a school in Ward 8, which is what we call east of the river here in the D.C. area. Our population is greatly comprised of African-American students. About 98% of our students are African-American, and we have about 2% Latino students at Ketchum. Just to give a little background, I actually started my career in education in California, starting off as a 5th grade teacher in Compton, California. Came from a family of educators, and at one point said that I was going to do anything but education, but we know how that goes. So my father was a community college professor at our local university or community college, and I really started to get the bug for education at a really young age. He taught English at the local community college and often got a lot of backlash about his English 1 class, which was heavily influenced by the works of African-American authors, specifically African-American women authors. And so I come from a family where I was raised to and think about social justice, racism, anti-bias work just throughout my growing up. And that kind of carried with me to my first teaching position as a 5th grade teacher, as I said, in Compton, California, then to working with LAUSD to do professional development work, to develop teachers' content pedagogy and content knowledge in LAUSD, then back to do teacher recruitment and hiring to create a high quality teacher pipeline for back in Compton Unified School District, and then here to Washington, D.C. in
Thank you so much. We're losing you a little bit, Maisha. I'm not sure why.
9 to start my career as a 7 in Ward 8, which if you're familiar, yep. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Oh, yep. So if you're familiar with DC, Ward 7 and Ward 8 are the two areas of the DC area with the highest concentrations of poverty and African American and African American students.
Thank you so much, Maisha. Maida, what about you? Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to this point?
Yeah, so first I just want to shout out Maisha. Maisha has been one of my mentors in DC Public Schools. She is very humble, but she was DC Public Schools Principal of the Year last year. So she does pretty incredible work, and I'm so honored to share this space with you. So my name is Mayra Cruz. Yo soy la directora de Oyster Adams Escuela Bilingüe. Yo sé que bastante de ustedes enseñan en español. Y I'm a proud, dual language, translanguaging model. So I come in and out of language pretty fluidly, and it is not because I don't know either well, it's because I have a Spanish brain, English brain, it connects, it connects here, and it's all right here, right? Mi familia es de Nicaragua, allí nacieron mis padres y mis hermanas, y yo fui la primera que nací aquí en los Estados Unidos. I was raised with the, pretty, untangible privilege of the coveted blue passport, right? But really understanding the immigrant and the undocumented experience, because my family, my sisters, my parents were undocumented for almost 13, 14 years. And my sister, my oldest sister, actually was a complete, what we would now call a dreamer, was here when she was 7, but made it all the way to college and still didn't have a green card. And I was raised in Hayward, California, which is a city right outside of Oakland. I'm wearing a proud 2 across my chest because I represent DC Public Schools, and I've been here for almost 12 years now. And, one thing I think that's really important about my story is that, one, I had the privilege of going to dual language schools growing up. And, the cause of dual language is really dear and true to my heart, because it was, exactly the type of programming that helped shape me. I also come from a progressive school district where I had an ethnic studies class taught to me when I was a junior and a senior in high school. So I had critical race theory thrown at me from a very young age. And I'm the youngest of 3. So my sisters were like, toma, toma, toma. So I was reading Power, Youth Identity and Power by Dr. Carlos Munoz when I was, 15. I was reading Lies My Teacher Told Me and the People's History of the United States when I was young. And even then, I remember I used to pore over the archives and at Berkeley, I UC Berkeley, because my sisters were enrolled there when I was younger. And I used to pore over archives, and I remember feeling, upset that I had not been taught certain things. Like, I learned Mendes versus Westminster on my own, right? Pouring through some of those things. So some of what the leading work of myself as an educator, I started out as a 4th grade teacher in Boston. Then I was a 6th grade teacher here in DCPS. But was about, like, how do I, arrange curriculum? And I was listening to Britt Hawthorne's work last week in your seminar to make sure that students don't ever feel the way that I felt, that around being let down of what they were taught and what they weren't taught. And then I think the other thing too that makes sense to know about my story is that I first came to DC with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute with CHCI, and it really opened up my eyes in terms of legislation and what it could do for communities of color in education and in all aspects. And then in college, I had the opportunity to do a semester exchange with a young lady at Howard University. So I experienced DC through the Mecca, right? Like through the Black excellent lens. And that's what really drove me back. And I've been in DC ever since. I'm the proud principal of Oyster Adams Bilingual School. We are celebrating 50 años next year of dual language excellence, but we are still learning. One of the things that we say is that we're a school that learns. And while Oyster is really celebrated in the dual language community. None of us have been there for 50 years, right? So we are standing on the shoulders of giants and reaching up for knowledge and trying to become better every day. Our new tagline is that we are on a mission to raise anti-racist bilingual kids. Y lo vamos a hacer todos juntos.
I love it. I love it, Mayra. I want you to know that Mayra is definitely a guerrillere. Just a couple of weeks ago, she invited me to go in and do some remote PD really quickly with her team to cause some further desmadre in the name of equidad and social justice. And so I love that we continue to learn. Maisha, one of the things that Mayra shared with me, because you and I have never had a chance to collaborate face-to-face, but she just told me, you need to meet her, you need to learn alongside her. Obviously today we are observing a very important day, Juneteenth, and I know that despite what some of our leaders say, in terms of Juneteenth, not all of us perhaps understand the importance fully. Would you mind just sharing with us, especially because we have a mixed group here of teachers that facilitate and educators that facilitate in monolingual settings, but also dual language. Why is today so important for all of us?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a famous quote that says, until all of us are free, none of us are free. That really resonates with me. And I think it really applies to today, specifically the Juneteenth holiday. I think it's important because as Americans, and we've all grown up in a traditional American educational system, we often feel the need to sanitize history. And the reality is that the Independence Day that we celebrate on July 4th was not Independence Day for people like me, for my ancestors, and for many people that may be on this call. And so I think it's really important that when we talk about celebrating certain days, we're truthful about what those days mean to people of color. So Juneteenth is the celebration day of the day that the final enslaved Americans, enslaved Africans were freed after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. So the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect January 1st, 1863. And it wasn't until June 19th, 1865 that the final Black slaves were freed in Galveston, Texas. So Juneteenth is a celebratory day in many African-American communities because it's the day that we were finally all free. So there's always, some contention about why it took 2.5 years for this to happen. And we can debate that, but I think that anybody with a critical mind will know why it took so long for it to happen. But in the African-American community, it's such a joyous day. It's such a celebratory day of the fact that we were all free. And this idea of pursuing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was something that was given to us, and we had an equal opportunity, although we didn't realize that opportunity, or that opportunity wasn't realized for us through segregation and Jim Crow. But it was the beginning of the opportunity for us to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So Juneteenth, really excited to celebrate. I usually host an annual cookout here at my house, but unfortunately with the pandemic, I'm unable to do that. But I think it's just important for people to realize that when we talk about historical celebrations, a lot of our historical celebrations are given to us by the perspective of the victor or people in power. And Juneteenth is an attempt for African-American communities to take back our power and celebrate our independence.
Thank you so much for sharing that information. I have to be honest and tell you that I was deprived of that information, much like Mayra was deprived of the information that she was speaking of earlier. It wasn't until I attended the University of Texas at El Paso that I learned about Juneteenth. And so thank you for sharing that information. One of the follow-up questions that I have for you, because I know that you're leading this anti-bias, anti-racism work specifically in one of the areas of DC where it is so needed, this work is so needed. How have you in the past really engaged the community in terms of Juneteenth celebrations?
Yep. So usually school's out by the time that Juneteenth, or it's the last day of school, or school's usually ending. But we always make a commitment to our school community just to try to educate not only our students and our families about the importance of Juneteenth. So even though we've been out of school for a couple of weeks now, in our internal school channel, we've shared information about Juneteenth, why it's important to celebrate. places that people can go to celebrate, things that people can do to honor the contributions of African Americans to this great country that we live in. And one of the most important things that we do is allow people time and space in order to talk about the difference between Juneteenth and the 4th of July, because that's really important. The majority of my staff is African American. The majority of the students that we serve are African American. And I think it's really important to create a space in our school community where we can discuss whether we have some staff members that refuse to celebrate 4th of July and why it's important to celebrate this holiday for us. So for us in our school community, it's really just about educating and honoring the work and the commitment that African Americans have in our community, and acknowledging our strength and resilience despite a history of oppression here in the United States.
Awesome. Thank you so much. One of the things that I've noticed, and this is for both of you, is that right now, especially in the world of education, most of us are good people. Like, I don't have the research to prove that, but I would guess that most of the people that logged on right now, like, you're good people. But a lot of what we've been seeing in terms of the support for Black Lives Matter really has been performative in nature. And one of the things that I keep telling teachers and administrators is that you can switch your profile to a black square. But if that's where it ends, then who cares? Or if you have a multicultural night, or if you have an event for Black History Month or Hispanic Heritage Month, that's performative. That's at the surface level. That's not the anti-bias, anti-racism work, critical consciousness work that needs to take place. So I'll start with Maida and then pass it on to you, Maisha. What are you doing as principals so that it is the culture in the school that this is the work, and that this will be the foundation for all of the literacy, by literacy, math, social studies, all of the instruction that is going to take place will be grounded in this work, especially when so many leaders are afraid to engage in that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that as a dual language school, we have 3 goals, right? It's it's bilingual, bicultural, high academic excellence, and social cultural competence, right? And the first, I think, is being really real around, like, what are the experiences of Black students and Black families and Black faculty members at your school? And if you have a blaring achievement gap, no, like, you are not meeting the needs of everybody in your school. So I think for many years, I have been very, transparent, clear, and honest with the school community that, like, I wake up every day to close the achievement gap, and you have to be on board with that. You have to be able to have high expectations academically for all of our students. And, I think that the other thing is the social cultural competency lens needs to live in different aspects of our lives, right? And I think that we've done a good job, but we have a long way to go. And I think that part of it is understanding that the cultural continuum is a continuum. I've said this a lot this year to the faculty at Oyster Adams, is that no one has ever arrived. And those educators that believe that they get it, that believe that they have arrived, are often the educators that make the most grave mistakes when it comes to anti-bias, anti-racism curriculum and decisions that we make in the school. So I think when we allow ourselves the time, the space to say, I have not arrived, I have a lot to learn. And, I have a lot to unlearn, because I grew up in a systematically racist society. I grew up with textbooks that were written by victors. I grew up not having access to the type of education that was meant for liberation, right? And I think that that's where we are right now as a school. And I have been super encouraged by how honest the faculty at the school, at the school that I lead, have invested in this space, because it's particularly in dual language schools. Like, my population is not like Maisha's, but it doesn't mean that Maisha and I cannot collaborate, right? I think Maisha and I have the same shirt on right now.
We really do.
And I think that sometimes as dual language schools, we isolate ourselves in thinking that we could only learn from other dual language schools, and that can't be further from the truth. Because the way that we teach, critical race theory really to our youngest students needs to be, you know, authentic and different depending on the audience of the students, right? It doesn't mean that we change the realness of it, but we have to honor the students that are in front of us. And my faculty, they're not my faculty. The faculty that I serve is
yourself, Mayra. You caught yourself. I love it.
the faculty that I serve is not majority, you know, Black or African American, and it's often not that way in dual language schools. We usually have a diverse faculty, but mostly Latino, right? Because we carry the language, and that also means
that I was listening to yesterday.
That also means
Mayra,
that.
can you pause for just a second?
I was like, "You're
Mayra,
awesome."
let me go ahead and mute everyone.
His Instagram's awesome. And he wrote back to me.
I can hear somebody. I'm trying to mute you.
Here. He's like, "This is a university I'm speaking at today."
1 second, Mayra.
You got it.
He's like, "Come listen."
There is one of you that is speaking and it is being recorded. I'm muting all of you. If you could please not engage in side conversations, I would greatly appreciate it, because we have two fabulous principals here sharing information. If you could check that you're muted, please, I would greatly appreciate it. You all are awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Principal Cruz.
And I think what the beauty of having a diverse worldly faculty also comes with the burden of teaching, right? Yourself and the going through an enlightenment process that was probably, you know, you were robbed from it if you grew up in American schools, right? So thinking about meeting the faculty where they are, I think has helped tremendously. You know, some of our faculty grew up in other countries, so the way that they experienced racism and systematic oppression is in a different context of the United States. Pero siempre hay conexiones, porque al decir que el racismo no existe, que es un problema americano, es mentira, right? Because if that were true, then the class structure in Latin America wouldn't be the way that it is right now, right? So, you know, the faculty is engaging, and some are like, ¿y quién es Ruby Bridges? ¿Cómo yo voy a enseñar eso si yo ni sé quién es? ¿Verdad? Others are, you know, ordering a people's history of the United States that is published in Spanish, right? So I think some people have to delve into the context of the United States while honoring and making connections to their own Latin American experience. And I think that must live within relationship building of school leaders and faculty, because nobody's going to be honest y decir, directora, es que yo no sé quién es Ruby Bridges, if that teacher feels like they're going to be judged.
Yeah, I think one of the things that becomes really obvious though, Mayra, and I'll let Maisha answer, is it takes the principal to actually put themselves in that very vulnerable position so that others are willing to engage in the work. I mean, we all know that schools take on the personality of the leadership. And so if you walk into a school and you want to throw yourself on the floor and cry and crawl out immediately, like that's your principal. And if you walk in and there's joy and there's excitement and energy, then that's the principal. And I think one of the things that we're hearing from you very clearly is that doesn't happen unless the principal is all in, and is actually saying, like, schooling in the United States was created to promote a white, monocultural, monolingual, patriarchal, heteronormative way of breathing and living. So it will happen in classrooms because teachers are awesome in spite of their leaders, but it won't scale to the school level or the district level. Maisha, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, because you are engaged in the work and really guiding this with your teachers, the teachers that you serve.
Yeah, I think there are some very specific practices that we have to do as school leaders to engage in like this true work. And just as you said before, the first step to any work about anti-racism or anti-bias in a school, whether it's very it's filled with African-American educators, primarily African-American educators and students like mine is, or whether it's a more diverse school community of students and educators, is first to make sure that we have that we allow people the space and time to be vulnerable and to examine our own biases. As you said before, we were all educated, or many of us, sorry, were educated in an American society, which comes from a perspective of the oppressor, comes from the perspective of the victor in history. And that's how the educational system in America has been taught to many of us here on this call and many of us around the globe. So it's really important to understand that there are many people of color, many Black people, many brown people, people all over the globe that have internalized some of the systems of oppression that we're working so hard to break down. So I think that vulnerability, allowing people the time and space to acknowledge that, you know what, like this system of oppression or this internalized oppression, hatred, say self-hate, whatever you want to call it, is something that I fell victim to as a person of color, as a Black person. For my school community, that's, I think, one of the most important things to do, because everybody looks very similar, but has very different experiences. And just to just outline just 5 things, like 5 quick hits that school leaders can do. I think, just like Myra said, seeking out the voices of Black students is so important. There's so many different experiences among the diaspora of African-American students in school communities. Seeking out those voices across the diaspora is, as well as across socioeconomic class, are not all the same. So elevating some of the voices that have been suppressed because of race, because of culture, because of class is really important in doing this work in your school community. And then I think principals, leaders of schools need to really be honest with themselves and examine the practices that are discriminatory or racist in practice. And that's hard a lot of times when everybody in a school community, or many members of your school community, are people of color. So in my school community, for example, just to give a quick example, we're in an urban school community, high poverty, and people expect, schools in our community to do things like slant, sit up straight, or to walk in a straight line. And people are like, yes, we have to do that to maintain control in our school community. And so as a school leader, it's my responsibility to push back and say, why is our goal control? Like, that's actually not the goal of an education community, to control students. It's actually to liberate them from control so that they can think and process the world in their own way, and contribute to it and become better members of our society. And so as school leaders, like, we have to step away from many things that we've been trained in many education programs to think are okay for Black children, for brown children, for students in poverty. So as school leaders, like, we have to lead that work in examining practices and being uncomfortable in the conversations that other Black educators, brown educators may have that may promote those practices. And I think also we have to look at what we're teaching, like in terms of our curriculum, right? We have to make sure that we're studying and teaching representative history as opposed to history from the oppressor or from the victor, from the historical standpoint. So there's so many different texts out there, different curricular resources that we use in our school community that gives us the position of not the victor or the oppressor, but those that are underrepresented or that were oppressed throughout history. So it's really important to elevate those voices in our curriculum and teach through those curricular materials, as well as teaching with them. And then I think also just creating this time and the space to develop relational trust in the school community so that these conversations can happen. It's really difficult for a community like mine. I have about 5 white teachers in my school community, for them sometimes to speak up. But if you create a system in which they feel comfortable speaking up, acknowledging what they don't know, and being able to share with their Black and brown colleagues what they want to learn from them, that's how we all grow. I had one of my white teachers send me a text message and say, hey, is it okay if I post this to the teachers to ask them about this? Because I'm interested in learning more about this. And we've created that culture of trust in our climate that when this teacher posted that, there were 5 teachers that immediately reached out to him to work with him through some of the questions that he had about the current state of our nation. And then finally, we all heard the phrase, if you see something, say something. right? Usually it has to relate with like terrorism or just safety. But as school leaders, if you see something, say something. And as a school, how to do is let small instances of of racism or biases continue, because then it infects your school community and permeates throughout the school community and grows stronger and stronger. So if I could leave anybody, like if you see something, say something, figure out how to approach it, but you cannot let instances of racism and biases, even with people of same ethnic groups, continue in school communities and expect to lead anti-racist schools.
And then, Jose, if I can add two things, especially in the dual language context, is beware of the strand models and the way that we talk about which kids are dual language kids and which kids do not fit into that model. Because if we really talked about investigation and research, and if we really are guerrilleras, guerrilleros, guerrilleres, right?
Wow.
We know that dual language can be a highly effective educational experience for all students. And saying the DL kids or the non-strand kids is really just racism in disguise a lot of the times, because you could see gentrification happening in strand schools that I think we just have to be really weary of. And then I think the other thing is a really practical thing for school leaders or for the teachers that are pushing for change or serving on your school's personnel committee is having specific questions in hiring about anti-racist, anti-bias work. So this year we actually completely changed the belief questions of our interview. And I almost never give out our interview questions, but I think that this one is so important, and it shows reflection and whether this person is ready to take on the work. And one of the things that we ask anybody that wants to work at Oyster is, tell us about a time where you heard a colleague say something racist. And we want you to tell us about a time where you did not speak up. Take me back to that moment. What happened? What stopped you? And what would you say today? And it is often the most reflective question, and it's emotional because those people often don't even have to think about it. They know exactly that moment where they heard it in the teacher's lounge, they heard it on a phone call, they heard it in a data meeting, and it sticks with you. When somebody says something like that and you don't speak up, you don't have to think about that moment, right? And it's an opportunity to say, go back in your time machine, right? What would you have said? And I need you to know that if you get hired to work at OA, you must be brave enough to confront that head on. And once you're our faculty member, we'll give you some words, like your words may not have aligned with our school values. Can we talk about that? Right? But it is so important for anti-bias, anti-racism work to make itself into the structure of your school, including and starting most importantly with your hiring practices.
I love that. Thank you, Maida. So there's this word in Spanish that my mom and my family uses, but my mom says all the time, no seas chillón, which means, you're crying quite quickly. Just listening to you and Maisha, I mean, I'm almost bursting into tears multiple times because I serve districts out there, and I just know that principals and instructional leaders and anti-bias, anti-racism folks aren't leading schools. And so it's really about making sure that the things that are being done by some leaders are being shared so that others can be willing to take that risk. Maida, one of the things that you mentioned is the continuum. And I wanted to just share where that comes from, because one of the things that makes it difficult on a campus is to engage in this work if you don't have some kind of framework. And you can choose whatever framework you'd like, but you need to have something, some tool that allows you to engage in this conversation so that you all have the same vocabulary. And so I think this is what Maida is referring to, the work of Lindsay Robbins and Terrell. This is their newest edition. And I have to tell you that I was reading their work as a principal, and I think that when I was a dual language principal, we did a really good job in terms of equity and social justice work, and we were engaged in it. This really helps because what it does is it gives everyone in the building the same language, and it's a never-ending journey. And so there are now campuses throughout the United States and internationally that use the cultural proficiency continuum from Lindsay Robbins and Terrell to guide conversations, not just with the staff, but also with kids and family members. I can tell you that even in my everyday life, like if my husband says something that is a little culturally destructive, I'll turn to him and I'll say, where is that on the continuum? And he says, not where it should be. I said, exactly. So we use it to catch ourselves as we too understand that we're a big hot mess, ¿verdad? Maisha, what about some resources or some specific tools that you use on your campus as you serve not just the students, but the teachers? Because I know that we have a plethora of educators that perhaps are wondering, like, what might be the first step for me?
Yeah, so I think one of the first steps, like I said, was just being vulnerable and creating that relational trust between teachers and staff. And one of the protocols and strategies that we use in our school community that was spearheaded by one of my assistant principals was the Courageous Conversations About Race protocols, because that allows an entry point for everyone. And initially, when we first introduced it in our school community, it was voluntary. And what we found, which was interesting enough, we don't have a lot of white educators in my school community. Every single last one of them wanted to join the Courageous Conversations About Race. But what we also noticed is that some of our staff members who were African-American, serving an African-American, primarily African-American community, that it said some pretty problematic things about our students and or the community I serve, were actually not the ones who thought that they needed to lean into a critical conversation about race. So then we had to talk about the uncomfortable as African Americans conversation sometimes about how we've internalized our own oppression and self-hate in our school community. And that's a really hard conversation to have. I'll just give a little anecdote. I had a teacher who made a comment that was problematic, and similar to like Myra's question, I would hope that if she was ever asked this question, that she would reflect upon this moment. And this staff member was an African-American woman who had grown up in poverty, who went to an HBCU, who was a member of a Black sorority. So she was Black, right? And in her mind. And it was really hard for her to hear from me that what she had said was not only anti-Black, but was dripped in prejudice and biases about members of her own community that were just like her. And we sat in the discomfort of me being, she was an African-American woman, me being an older Black woman, telling her about her own prejudice and her anti-Blackness. And in her mind, she's like, I went to a HBCU, there's no way, I'm very pro-Black. And it took her a while to sit with it. So she left out of my office very uncomfortable and then came back 30 minutes later and was still uncomfortable and ready to like spar with me. And I was like, girl, it's 5 p.m., right? Like, go home and think about this tomorrow. But it was really sitting on her heart. And we sat down and we worked through what was making her feel uncomfortable, what made me feel uncomfortable about her comment. And at the end of the conversation, we came through with her having a different understanding about what it meant to be anti-racist as a Black person serving in a Black community, in a Black system of education. So that's an example of someone you would want in those courageous conversations about race, because oftentimes we think that the systematic and the institutionalized anti-Black biases can't seep in through us because we're Black, we consider ourselves pro-Black, we have a pro-Black t-shirt on, we wear African print shirts, all the performative stuff that doesn't really get to the root about what makes our actions and words anti-Black in nature. And I also think teaching tolerance has great resources for educators. There's also a tool, Rethinking Elementary Schools, that created a book called Rethinking Elementary Schools that not only talks about anti-Blackness and how to eliminate that in your school community, but like anti-Latino, anti-immigrant bias, which I think is just as equally important in many ways. So the Rethinking Elementary School tool, I think I have the book here. It's Rethinking Elementary Education. I would strongly recommend that anyone pick up that book. It has articles, things that you can do to facilitate group conversations. And then I think also we've done book studies. I purchased the book for white people who teach in the hood for a summer book study. And people are like, we don't have any white people that, we don't have that many white people at our school. I was like, yeah, but some of the stuff in this book, y'all have said as Black people. So you read it too. And the full title is like, for white people who teach in the hood and for the rest of y'all too. And we are the rest of y'all too. Some of the problematic things that we've been saying. And then I think just seeking out just literature, whether it be the How to Be Anti-Racist books, but just literature that you can share with your school community and have honest discussions around using some of the protocols and the courageous conversations about race. Text.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Maisha. And I think that one of the things that I definitely wanted to ask both you and Maida about is it's important to get this work being done, obviously, with the adults in the room, but it also has to be work that students are engaging in, because at the end of the day, what good is it if they learn content if they're not able to collaborate and cooperate and empathize with one another? And so I wanted to give a shout out. I've had the opportunity to visit Maida's campus, and one of the lessons that I remember when I did a classroom visit several years ago that I still share in PD was one of the early childhood grades had actually taken the standards and had created a unit for the students around Afro-Latinos. And that was important because those things don't happen by chance. And so to my dual language friends, but also to those of you that are not in dual language, remember that there's this thing called a culture learning target. And there are 4 ways to write a culture learning target. 1, amplifying the voices of marginalized communities. 2, connecting to the child and or to the real world. 3, focusing on cross-linguistic connections and translanguaging. And 4, really allowing students to understand that academic and social language are equals, because so often in schools, language has been used as the tool of oppression. And so when a kid says sup or bulls, that becomes the way in which we control. Maisha, I want you to know that one of the times that you almost made me cry right away was when you said our job is not to control, our job is to liberate. I've never heard anyone say that out loud, especially not a principal. And I want you to know that at that moment, I was yours, not in a weird way. Yours, because that's what every single one of us needs to wake up and think as we're showering. Today, I am going to liberate the hell out of anyone in my path. Like that needs to be what we're doing. I want to share this book, Maida. I know you have some resources as well. This book is for young adolescents, for I would say anywhere like 5th grade and up, but it's called This Book is Anti-Racist. I actually did a hashtag Medina Monday message on it, and it is a great starting point. It's not specific to dual language, but I think any classroom in any building in this country would benefit from this work. Maida, anything that you would like to share in terms of students? Because students have to do this.
Yeah. I think that one thing is ensuring that parents are part of your decision-making protocols, because they are the biggest window into your students, right? So at my school, we have a parent-led Black committee, and they're often my sounding boards, right? Before I send something, before I think about something, they're the people that I go to and say, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm struggling with. And then they are able to connect my larger vision ideas to small anecdotes around the real life experience of their children at Oyster Adams. And I think that is so important to fuel, because sometimes kids tell you, but other times they go home and just tell your parents. And the parents are often, don't necessarily know how much to navigate what gets told and what doesn't, and what gets shared and what doesn't. And it's often very painful things that our school community is doing. So I think it's so important to have a direct line of communications with parents, because especially in elementary schools, they are the ones getting the stories and the feelings and the real life connections of the experiences of their children. The other part is shared vocabulary en español. Porque una de las cosas que hemos hablado con las profesoras en Oyster es que aunque algunas son nativas en español o enseñan español, se sienten más cómodas hablando de racismo, of anti-Blackness, of Black Lives Matter in the vernacular of English, right? And then there's all this conflict, right? It's like, bueno, decir negro es malo, o se dice moreno, o se dice esto, because being a Latino does not absolve you of anti-Blackness, right? So this idea of like, we've been taught to say or not say certain words, and those are the words that are going to come out in lessons and read alouds and conversations. So one of the things that we that came up really the last couple weeks with the faculty is people just straight up being honest. Like, I need the language, the vernacular, because I feel so much more comfortable. They're teaching science, matemáticas, humanidades en español, pero all of their learning around Black Lives Matter, around revolutionary causes, has been in English, right? So finding the resources, right now there are a lot of resources of talking about anti-negritud, right? And talking about what it means to do those words, and sharing some of those vocabulary building so that Oyster can say, this is what we say, this is what gets translated, and this is what doesn't, right? And because that will become the vocabulary of our students in Spanish. And for Maisha, we want to liberate them in spaces, in bilingual spaces too. We don't want them to think, oh, solo me siento cómoda hablando con esto en inglés, and then we don't want to make these, judgment errors in how we talk about it. So I think that that's super important. There's still not a lot of publishing around it, honestly. Like, we need more publishers, we need more researchers to be able to say, así es como se habla en español en el contexto de los Estados Unidos en 2020. And I've seen some things coming up on social media, but really rising the voices of the organic intellectuals and the community organizers that are doing that work, and getting them into our schools as quickly as possible. Because to raise anti-racist kids, I need kids to be able to talk about anti-Blackness and being anti-racist in ambos idiomas.
Claro. Mayra, you and I have touched upon this conversation, but that whole idea of anti-negritud en la comunidad latina.
One thing, Jose?
Yeah, absolutely, Maisha.
Oh, sorry, my internet just froze. Yeah, to Myra's point, so one of my side passions is travel, and traveling to diaspora destinations all over the world, specifically in Southern and Central America. And one of the things that I was struck by, and first of all, I was really excited because throughout this conversation, I've understood the majority of what Myra says. So my Spanish is still intact. So I feel good about that. But in one of my trips to Colombia, I went to San Basilio de Palenque, which is the first free town in Colombia of African slaves. So they escaped from Cartagena, Colombia, went to San Basilio de Palenque, started their own community, have their own language, have their own traditions, and their language is a combination of Spanish and Bantu, an African language. And one of the things while I was there touring, and I've been there 3 times, that they said is one of the things that helped them so much with anti-Blackness in the Latino community, that they may see in Colombia, was having a class where the students in San Basilio de Palenque sit as an elective and talk to their elders. And they hear the stories of not only the Colombian struggles, but also the Afro and Afro-Colombian struggles in their country. And they talk about the contributions and elevate the voices of the contributions of Afro-Colombians. And so I think so many times, as we think about 2 communities that have both been so marginalized, the African/African-American community and the Latino community, I think a lot of times what we sometimes forget about is the bridge between the 2. And I was just so, I was moved to tears that these Afro-Colombian students were able to sit at the feet of an elder and hear about their community and develop pride from not only being African, but being Latino as well.
That's so important. It's actually something that's been coming up a lot, Maisha, in the world of dual language. So what I've done is I actually have reached out to 2 colleagues that do work in this area. And next Friday, I'm going to be traveling because of family reasons. But on July the 3rd, we're going to have on that Friday the 3rd session. This is our 2nd, and that one is going to be focused on that anti-Black sentiment that is so prevalent in the Latino community. And it's going to be facilitated, that session, in both English and Spanish, obviously because the participants are going to be 2 really, really amazing colleagues who are engaging in that work. I'm taking a look at the questions because we have about 8-9 minutes. One of the questions is, can we have a list of all of the resources? So absolutely, I'm looking forward to one of you watching the recording so that you can put it in the notes on YouTube, because remember that one of the things that is important in this work is that we can't be asking others to do the work for us. And so I have two amazing guests that are doing this because of the kindness of their heart. And so it's upon us that we need to go ahead and re-listen and make sure that we identify the list. And so I'm so excited that somebody brought that up. Snap, snap. I mean, after all,
wow. I mean, honestly, that, Jose, that right there, because I've been hearing a lot like the last week around like asking for the labor of people of color to educate. And just the simple fact that you just said that just taught me something of how to call out action to anti-racism. So I really appreciate that. I'm taking that with me right now.
Well, and I know that it comes from a good place, but we need to remember that right now is not the time to oppress those that are oppressed all the time. You have two women of color who are fabulous and doing this work, and then an openly queer, little brown, short, handsome man. And so I'm so looking forward to you all doing the work for us. I mean, the recording will be
right.
You're welcome. Let me take a look at some other questions. Maisha, see, now you know what you got yourself into.
Right, I do.
I see some questions in terms of intersection, not just with Black Lives Matter, but like homophobia and other perspectives. Would either of you like to tackle that? Because definitely this is not just about anti-racism, it is about anti-bias.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of my biggest pieces of advice right now, y para todas las maestras, yo sé que están cansadas, y están cansados, y están cansadas, right? Like you have just done some of the hardest, and if one more person says unprecedented, I might like scream, right? Porque yeah, I miss the president at times sometimes. But you have just gone through something very hard. And it really put the communities, on your shoulders and on your backs. Pero this is really the time to dig deep. If not us, who? If not now, when? This is the time to revolutionize those unit zeros and unit ones. And I know that you're tired, right? So like take some time and rest, but look deeply at what you have been told to teach, and does it actually teach things that matter? And I'm not saying let go of standards, because if you listen to Zaretta Hammond's work, right, you have to have good readers and writers in order to be taken seriously and make social change agents. But like, what are those topics, those essential questions, and those themes that you're gonna do? And our last day was today. On Monday, it's technically a work day. And I was so inspired by the guerrilleros and guerrilleras at Oyster, because I just said, look, I'm open. I can do open office hours with you. Let's talk about revolutionizing that unit, our 4th grade unit. Ms. Hopkins, you're on here. I see you. We usually have heroes, a heroes unit in DC public schools. And we got to talk about these monuments that are coming down. Right. And then in the English side and the Spanish side, we got to talk about what monuments are in Latin America. Right? And who gets to decide who the victors are, and who gets to decide when this happens, and looking at the timeline of Confederate monuments and where they get placed, because they get placed in courthouses for a reason. And there are spikes after the Civil Rights Movement for a reason. They are signs of supremacy. They are signs of intimidation. And that's what we need to be teaching when we're talking about heroes, right? In 4th grade. So I know that you're tired. I know that we have a long time to reflect, and thinking about, at our school, we're calling it DL squared, dual language distance learning. But this is the time to really seek out, and to really, if you don't have the instructional coach available, if you don't have the principal available, start to reach out to your liberation fronts, right? Your groups, the people that you trust. They might not be educators, but we need to start teaching things that matter.
Yeah. Maisha, anything that you would like to add in terms of in the intersection of different folks that have been marginalized? And also there was a question about gentrification in terms of housing and the neighborhoods in which schools are situated.
Yeah, So I think when we think about the intersection of just like oppressed groups in general, it's important I just want to go back to that quote, like, until we're all free, none of us are free, right? And I think, like, as Black people specifically, we know our own particular history here in the United States, and the history of slavery and how that's impacted us, and segregation and Jim Crow afterwards. But I always tell people, like, we cannot turn into the oppressor of other marginalized groups that are fighting for oppression and liberation like us as well. And I think often, so many times, because our story is so strong and filled with hate and oppression, biases, prejudice, murder, rape, all of those things that are so tragic and have impacted us in many ways as African Americans here in this nation, that sometimes we are so centered on our own experience that we fail sometimes, some of us, to look at the experience of other marginalized communities because it's not as bad as us. But the reality is that if there's any instances of oppression, whether it be from gender, sexual orientation, poverty, those instances should impact us even more, because as African Americans, we know how it feels to feel it from all angles. As an African American woman, I know how it feels from the racial angle. I know how it feels to be a woman. Luckily, my own is not oppressed, that hasn't experienced some sort of oppression in our nation. And as an African-American person, I refuse to be a Black face of oppression on another group just because I don't identify with that group.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, right now, Maisha, everyone is.
Maisha, you are so inspiring.
Yeah. Everyone right now saying Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. But when you put the slogan, when you actually say Black Lives Matter, then you need to be willing to say Black trans women lives matter, Black homeless folks matter. Like, it can't just be us picking and choosing, right? So thank you to the two of you. I just cannot even believe that you made time on such short notice to come and share and learn alongside us. I'm thrilled. If you have any other resources that you'd like to share, please do so at this time. One of you had asked about white fragility. Remember that right now, for those of you that identify as white, we see you, we love you. It is not your time. And so stop buying white fragility. There are other books that can amplify the voices of Black folks, like this book. My friend last week, Tiff shared this with us. If you're gonna buy a book, buy How to Be Anti-Racist.
Yes, that's a good one.
Yeah,
I just bought the anti-racist baby book for my cousin for her baby shower coming up. He has a book, and the anti-racist babies. So it's a baby book. It's never too early to start.
And I did see a quick comment around, like, do you have advice on how to navigate this with admin that are not willing to have this conversation? And that is such a critical question. And one, I would just say, honestly, especially if it's a person of color, is to try to relate with empathy, because to lead and be a person of color is uncomfortable. You often are thinking about how other people are going to view you. Are you too revolutionary? Are you too political? And sometimes school leaders, I'm telling you, because I am one, it's so lonely. And sometimes you have to be met with empathy first. I mean, sometimes we got to push, right? But other times we need somebody to also see us and guide us, because we often grew up in the same oppressive schools that we have to unlearn too. But especially if you have, a administrator that represents a, BIPOC, background, it's important that they feel that they have allies in the work too, because we are often double questioning how our actions are going to affect the stakeholders, and the principalship can be so political and so lonely at times. So my biggest advice is to approach with empathy.
Thank you so much. Everyone, will you welcome me? Will you join me in thanking Maisha, por favor?
Bravo.
Gracias.
Se aventaron con
Gracias.
¡Bravo!
Wonderful.
Yo te bendigo.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Acabar desmadre. Thank you, Mayra. Thank you, Maisha.
Gracias, José. Gracias, Mayra.
Amazing. Thank you.
Adelante a todas sin miedo, todos sin miedo.
That's
Todos
right.
sin miedo.
I'm with you on that. Adios, everybody.
Chao, muchas
Bye,
gracias.
everyone.
Chao, güerita.
Excelente trabajo, gracias.
Excelente.
Thank you.
That's my little sister. I'm so proud of you.
Muchísimas gracias.
Let's go back to San Basilio de Palenque, Maisha.
Yes, my favorite, one of my favorite places.
Everybody should go there.
In Peru.
Yeah, I've been to Chincha in Peru. I told you guys, diaspora destinations.
Awesome. Let's go together next time.
Go to outdoor
Interest
recess.
is traveling to diaspora
Outdoor
destinations all over.
Bye.
Before you,
Yes, go to
before you
outdoor
go back
recess.
to San Basilio.
Mayra and Maisha, thank you
care.
so much. I'm so grateful. Thank you for making the
Yo
time.
fui la que le dije.
Me agradezco.
You know,
Adios, everybody.
adios.